Good day, dear students. You are welcome to our today's lecture on the course Translation Problems. The first lecture is devoted to the theme Translation Theory. Please write down the plan of our lecture. There are 6 points. The notion of the course Translation Problems. The second, main objectives of translation problems study. The third, methods of investigation. The fourth, translation as the form of language mediation. The fifth, the communicative scheme of translation. And the sixth, forms of the adaptive transit code. Let's start from the very first point. Theoretical research is to discover what translation is, to find at what objective factors underline the translator's intuition, to describe the ways and methods by which the identity of the communicative value of source text and target text is achieved. Translation can be the object of the scientific study aimed at understanding its nature, its components, and their interaction, as well as various factors influencing it or linked with it in a meaningful way. The object of Translation Problems course is Science of Translation or Translation Theory, which is concerned both with theoretical and applied aspects of translation studies. The theoretical description of the translation phenomenon is the task of the Translation Problem course. What is generally understood as a translation involves rendering of the source language text into target language text to ensure that the surface meaning of the two texts is approximately similar. The structures of the source language text are preserved as closely as possible, but not so closely that target language structures will be seriously distorted. The main objectives of the Translation Problems course are the following: to reveal and describe general linguistic principles of translation, that is, to point out what peculiarities of language systems and what laws of language functioning make up the basis of translating process, after this process possible, and determine its character and limits. To determine translation as the object of linguistic investigation, point out its difference from other forms of language mediation. To work out principles of classification of translators' activity. To reveal the essence of translation equivalence at the basis of communicative identification of texts in source language and target language. To find out general principles and peculiarities of constructing the translation theory in general for all the languages and for various combinations of languages. To work out general principles of scientific description of translating process as translators' activities and operations to transform source language text into target language text. To reveal the influence of pragmatic socio-linguistic factors on the process of translation, to define the notion of the translation norm and work out principles of evaluating of the translator's quality. The Problems of Translation course provides the translator with the appropriate tools of theoretical analysis and synthesis, makes him aware of what he is to look for in the original text, what type of information he must convey in target text, and he should act to achieve his goal. Methods of investigation are the following. One of the most important methods of investigation in translation theory is comparative analysis of translation. Translation is the form of language mediation. The task of translation is to provide the interlingual communication when target language text could be used as full communicative replacement of source language text and identified by receptors with the text in source language in the functional, structural, and semantic relations. The communicative scheme of translation. Here you see the scheme, that is source language receptor, source language text, and source language text author. Then translator, target language text, and target language receptor. Referring to linguistic sciences, linguistic theory of translation widely uses methods of receptive sciences: grammar, lexicology, stylistics, social linguistics, and psycholinguistics. One of the most important methods of investigation in translation theory is comparative analysis of translation. That is, we analyze the form and the content of target text, comparing it with the source text, and these texts present objective facts which can be observed and analyzed. Comparing these texts, it's possible to find out the inner mechanisms of translation, to reveal equivalent units, and also find those changes of the form and content which take place in the replacement of a source language unit by an equivalent of target language unit. It is possible to compare two or several translations of one and the same source text. Comparative analysis gives the opportunity to find out how typical difficulties of translation are overcome, difficulties connected with the peculiarities of languages, and what elements of the original text are not transmitted in translation. The general theory of translation is concerned with the fundamental aspects of translation inherent in the nature of bilingual communication and therefore common to all translation events, irrespective of what languages are involved. Basically, replacement of source text by target text of the same communicative value is possible because both texts are produced in human speech, governed by the same rules and implying the same relationships between language, reality, and human mind. All languages are means of communication. Each language is used to externalize and shape human thinking. All languages units are meaningful entities related to non-linguistic realities, and all speech units convey information to the communicants. The linguistic theory of translation deals with source text and target text, and also with the process of reforming source text into target text. So translation provides the opportunity to communicate for people speaking different languages, the opportunity of interlingual communication. Speech communication can be carried out between people speaking different languages. In this case, we say interlingual or bilingual communication takes place. As the receptor cannot get information from the text said or written in the language he doesn't know, interlingual communication is of mediation character. This communication is possible of condition that there is an intermediate section which carries out this interlingual mediation, that is, transforms initial information into the linguistic form, which can be got by a receptor. A mediator should get the information from the initial text and convey it into other language. That is why this function can be done only by the person who speaks two languages, who is bilingual. That is an interpreter. Translation is a form of linguistic mediation which is fully aimed at source language text. We consider translation as belonging to another language form of the information contained in the source language text. The task of translation is to provide the interlingual communication when the text in the language of the receptor could be used as full communicative replacement of the text in the source language and identified by the receptors with the text in a source language in the functional, structural, and semantic relations. Functional identity is the fact that translation very often seems to belong to the author of the text in the source language, published under his name, discussed and quoted as if it were a source text, but in the different language. Semantic identity is the fact that receptors of translation consider that the text in the target language transmits fully the content of the text in the source language. Structural identity is that receptors of translation consider that translation reproduces a source text on the whole and it deals too. It is supposed that the translator gives exactly the structure of the text in the source language, doesn't change anything in the text, doesn't or add anything into text in the target language. So, the translation is the form of linguistic mediation in the process of which the text in the target language is constructed. This text is a communicative equivalent of the text in the source language, and it is expressed in its identity by receptors, which the text in the source language functionally, structurally, and by its content. The communicative approach in translation is the leading principle of translation theory. The process of translation carried within the interlingual communication that can be presented by following scheme. At the beginning, the interlingual communication, there is an author of the source text. Using the source text, the units of which reflect directly or indirectly the reality, an author creates the text in the source language, which contains some information. This information is for a foreign receiver who speaks the same language, has the same cultural, historical, and linguistic experience. Then the process of interlingual communication is continued by a translator. He has a very important role in this process. The translator takes part in the process as a receptor of the text in the source language and then creates the text in the other language, the target language, which is now meant for the other target receiver who speaks the target language and is oriented at the experience and circumstances common with the translator. The translator not only creates a text in the target language, he creates the translation of the original text, which must be semantically, functionally, and structurally identified with the original. Thus, translator is the receptor of the original text. He creates the text in the target language and creates translation. Adaptive transencode is the form of linguistic mediation when not only the transencode of information from one language into another takes place, but also its adaptation. That means transformation. It means that information is put in the other form, which is determined not only by the structure of this information, but by a peculiar goal, a peculiar task of the interlingual communication. Adaptive transencode, like translation, presents a sort of representation of a source language text's content into a target language. But unlike translation, the text being created is not aimed at being a full replacement of the original text. Adaptive transencode can be presented as the union of two consecutive transformations, translation and adaptation made in the text. Different forms of adaptive transencode have different degrees of coincidence with the translation, but the main feature which makes translation and adaptive transencode alike is that it is also this or that representation of the original in the other language. Most of all translation characteristics are found in such forms of adaptive translation code as abridged translation and adapted translation. Abridged translation is the form of translation when, for some moral, political, and some other practical reasons, some parts of source language text are omitted. It is supposed that the translated parts are the communicative value equal to the same part in the source language text, though the whole original text is presented partially. Adapted translation is found in practical explication, that is, simplification and explanation of the original structure and content in the process of original, with the aim of making the text of the translation more understandable for some groups of receptors who may not have enough knowledge and professional or life experience necessary for the full comprehension of the source language text. Very often, such adaptation is connected with the translation of a scientific text which is aimed at readers who are non-specialists in this sphere of science, or it may be a text allotted for grown-ups, but for some reasons it is necessary to translate this text for young children, for example, translation of famous classical novels. Reduction and adaptation can be interconnected and carried out simultaneously in the translation of one and the same source language text. In any case, the text being created is named translation, though the fact of its being abridged or adapted is mentioned separately. Pragmatic adaptation may serve as an example of adaptive translation code aimed at making an unexpected impact which is carried out in the transformation of various advertisements in the other language. These ads provide sales to the goods being advertised. Adaptive translation code aimed at a given volume and character of information is carried out through making annotations, presses, and other forms of information transformation connected with the selection and regrouping of information contained in source language text. Thank you for your attention.